Hello and welcome to this important update brought to you by Washington REALTORS. I'm Jeff Smart, your 2024 Washington REALTORS president. Today we're diving into a significant moment in the real estate industry centered around the National Association of Realtors' recent agreement to settle a nationwide class action lawsuit. This settlement has profound implications, not only for our members, but the future of real estate transactions across the country. To navigate through the complexities of this settlement, we brought together Washington REALTORS CEO Nathan Gorton and our legal hotline lawyer Annie Fitzsimmons for an in-depth conversation. They'll cover some top takeaways from the proposed settlement, its potential impact to our members, and how Washington REALTORS is already steps ahead in adapting to these changes. This is a turning point that could redefine industry standards and is crucial for all of us to stay informed and prepared. Let's listen in on what Annie and Nathan have to share.
Thank you, President Jeff, for that warm welcome. I'm here with Annie Fitzsimmons to talk a little bit about the NAR settlement. Annie, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Great. Well, obviously, there have been a lot of questions that have come our way about the settlement that NAR announced on Friday. And we really wanted to take a little time, actually read the settlement document and talk to some people that we trust to figure out what it means for realtor practitioners in Washington state. There were plenty of cold takes given this weekend, and so we thought we would come and provide you a few nuggets that we know for sure are going to come out of this settlement. And there still will be questions, but we think we know a few things here, right?
Agreed.
Okay, great. So it's really important to state right up top that this settlement is not final, right? A court still has to approve it. Between now and the court approving it, there could be any number of parties who come out and make a case as to why some piece of it is not in the best interest of consumers. And so we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if any modifications will come from that.
Yeah, I mean, just by way of explanation, I think it's helpful to understand that because this settlement has come out of a class action lawsuit, that means that the court has to approve the lawsuit. In a typical lawsuit, plaintiff and defendant can reach agreement and then that's done. But in a class action lawsuit, part of the court's role is to protect the unknown plaintiff, the class members who've not yet been identified. So no class action lawsuit can be settled by the parties alone. The court has to approve. And in a class action lawsuit like this one, where there is an expectation that the Department of Justice, federal agency, may want to weigh in on the settlement, the court would certainly hear the Department of Justice opinion if one is given. So those are really the primary factors between where we are today and this settlement agreement or some variation of it becoming final.
Okay. So with that caveat that it is not yet final and the court still has to approve it, let's talk a little bit about some of the things we know from the settlement document. As far as liability for our members, for our local associations, and our association-owned MLSs. Let's talk about liability for those three groups and what this settlement says about that.
I've been saying for months that I thought that most of our Washington realtors and real estate brokers generally in Washington were in a better position from a liability perspective than a lot of real estate brokers across the country, just because of the changes in policies and practice already implemented within Washington. I still believe that's true. But if there was any lingering liability for our individual broker members, this settlement, if it becomes effective, will eliminate that liability for the vast, vast majority of our members.
Okay, good news.
Yeah.
Local associations?
Local associations, and I'm happy to say our state association.
Thank you.
The Washington REALTORS. Washington REALTORS and all of our local realtor associations, all of our local realtor associations will be relieved of any potential liability arising from the fact pattern that was asserted in the seller-based class action lawsuits, along with our NAR MLSs in Washington state.
So let's talk a little bit about how this will affect practitioners and real estate transactions moving forward, right? So there were kind of three legs to the stool of this settlement.
That's right.
So let's talk about those three legs.
Right. The policy
Yes.
changes.
Yes.
I call it a three-legged stool for the policy changes. The three legs of that stool include that every buyer broker will be required to enter an agency agreement, a compensation agreement with their buyer at the outset of providing real estate brokerage services. Does that sound familiar?
That does sound familiar.
The second is that the agreement from seller to pay compensation to the brokers in the transaction must be negotiated in a decoupled agreement. And what we mean by that term is that a seller will negotiate compensation with the listing firm and agree to pay compensation to the listing firm in an established amount. And completely untethered from that agreement to pay compensation to the listing broker, the seller will, if they choose, make an offer of compensation to the buyer broker. But there will be no link between a seller's agreement to pay listing firm and any offer of compensation that may be made to a buyer broker. Does that sound familiar?
It does.
Decoupled compensation. All of our members who have been using since January 1st of this year either Form 1A or Form 1A SWF, statewide forms, as their listing agreement, you're already working with this decoupled compensation structure. Nothing new there for our brokers. The third leg of this three-legged stool is that NAR MLSs will be prohibited from publishing any seller offer of buyer broker compensation. That's going to be new to everybody.
Yes.
That's going to be new to everybody in Washington and everybody across the country. But if you're a Washington realtor compared to realtors in 49 other states, many of them are going to have all three legs of this three-legged stool to incorporate into their practice for the first time ever between now and this settlement agreement taking effect. Washington realtors, most of you are 2/3 of the way there.
That's great.
It's really good.
So obviously there's this question out there about buyer, is this the end of buyer agency? Is this the end of buyer agent commissions?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that question?
Well, answering that question from the perspective of the settlement agreement first,
Okay.
and then from just a more practical perspective, the settlement agreement allows for NAR MLSs, if this settlement agreement takes effect, to publish an offer by seller to pay a concession on behalf of the buyer. So if a buyer wants assistance, for example, paying their closing costs or offsetting some of their closing costs, then a seller may offer concessions to a buyer through the MLS. That offer of concession, if accepted by the buyer, cannot be conditioned on the buyer being represented by a buyer broker. So the seller's offer of concessions could be used to pay buyers' traditional closing costs, could be used to pay a buyer's existing obligation to compensate their own broker. But that seller's offer of concessions cannot be conditioned on the buyer hiring a buyer broker. So that's the answer to your question from the settlement agreement's perspective, but I think that within the industry there's a much more fundamental answer to the question. If your question is, let's assume this settlement agreement takes effect in July of 2024, if your question to me is, will buyers still need a buyer broker in August 24? My answer would be buyers are going to need a buyer broker in August 24 every bit as much as they need a buyer broker in June 2024. So what value, buyer broker, do you bring to the buyer? I would turn that question around on a buyer broker, on our Realtor members, and say, will your buyers need you if this settlement agreement takes effect? Are you worth the compensation that you're paid as a buyer broker? I think you are. I have been represented by numerous buyer brokers over the course of my adulthood. And I would say that every single one of them earned the compensation they were paid. Are you in the same boat?
I'm in the exact same boat. Absolutely. There's no question.
And I also believe that every buyer broker I've ever used could articulate the value that they brought to me. So buyer brokers, that would be your challenge. How are you going to explain to a buyer your value? And if you need time to think about that, then this is it. This is that time. I suspect many of you have already figured out what your value is, because you don't get a buyer to enter a buyer agency agreement with you, which you've been doing since January 1st, without explaining your value.
And there's just a continuation of the conversation that has been happening since January 1st.
That's right. That's right. I know that a lot of folks are feeling like the sky is falling right now. The train just ran right off the track.
This is an industry that has always innovated and that has always figured out new challenges, whether it's high interest rates, really high interest rates, right? There was they figured that out, a lack of inventory, whatever it may be. It's an industry that's always innovated.
Yeah, I mean, and even just within Washington, if you've been around long enough, you remember when we converted to statewide forms. There was a fear then that the sky was falling, and you don't even have to go back that far. Remember last fall when we talked about this crazy new concept that every buyer broker would have to enter a buyer agency agreement? That felt like the sky was falling to a lot of brokers. Here we are in March of 2024, and the sky is still firmly in place. So we're going to get there, and I think that concern and hesitation and asking questions is all of those things are very, very appropriate, and you should be doing all of those things.
We also may not have all of the answers just yet.
We don't have all of the answers.
And there's still very good questions and valid questions, and sometimes the answer from us is, it's a good question and we don't know. But we're trying to figure this out with you all as well.
That's right. Just remember who you are, what you do for buyers, help buyers to understand that. And I don't know a single buyer who needs you in June who's not going to need you in August.
As more facts come out, as we hear more, we're going to continue to update our members. For now, I want to thank you, Annie, for being here. Have anything else you'd like to tell our members?
Hang in there. It's going to be okay. It is going to be okay. We've done this before. Not this, but we've done this before.
Absolutely. And Washington Realtors will be here to help shine a light on that path forward.
100%. If you have questions, you know how to get hold of me. Visit warealtor.org and ask me a question.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for being a member of Washington Realtors. And let's turn it back over to President Jeff.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. I hope it has provided a little clarity on the NAR lawsuit settlement and what it means for us as Washington Realtors. As we've heard, while the settlement is pending final court approval, its components signal a shift towards greater transparency and fairness in real estate transactions, a shift that Washington Realtors has been proactive in embracing. As this situation evolves, rest assured that we will continue to provide you with the latest information and guidance. Members, please don't hesitate to reach out to the legal hotline if you have further questions. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.